So Trump is pretty infamously against taking action on climate change. During his last term of president, he started the process of withdrawing the US from the UN Paris Agreement. And obviously, one of his key slogans this time around has been drill, baby, drill. And he's got a really key pledge around increasing fossil fuel production in the United States. I'm just going to share a little clip right now because it's really important to acknowledge that actually the United States, in terms of production of oil and gas, has actually been on the rise under both Trump and Biden administrations in the last 3 successive US administrations. And this is in the context of the US is doubling down on fossil fuels at a time when we need massive investment in renewables, which China is, of course, leading the way on. And this is in the context of the latest warnings of the United Nations just last month in October that humanity is currently now on course for a catastrophic 3 degrees of warming. I mean, we don't need to project into the future to see what's actually happening, though. 2023 was the hottest year in human history, with nearly half of the days breaching that 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature limit, which has been set by the UN. And scientists, of course, fearing that 2024 could be even hotter. I think new data is actually coming out on that as we speak. And then we can turn to the devastating real-world impacts of climate change that we are already witnessing. So just to give a few, in October this year, the Sahara Desert flooded for the first time in nearly half a century. In 2023, there were floods in Libya, which killed over 5,000 people, with more than 10,000 reported missing due to Storm Daniel, which made landfall, bringing severe weather conditions. This year in Brazil, there's been catastrophic flooding, resulting in 181 fatalities, and considered to be the country's worst flooding in 80 years. And of course, the coverage actually in the mainstream mass media tends to focus more on things that happen in the global north in terms of climate disaster. So we've seen a lot of coverage of what's happened in Spain recently in terms of the flooding, which killed over 214 people. So, we are witnessing all of these things happening right now, and we're on track for something a lot more catastrophic in the near future. So, Matt, I was wondering if you could come in. Obviously, you're a member of the Green Party in the United States. What can we expect from a Trump presidency on climate change? And also, what is the relationship between empire, militarism, and climate? And also, just where is the US population at on this issue?
Thanks, Fiona. The U.S. population, it continues to show up in polls that 20%, 30% are concerned. Other polls will show more than that. Younger generations are obviously more concerned about climate change and the climate collapse than older generations. But there's not much action on it. And what we see essentially the chart there. Both parties, the White Houses, whether they're Democrat or Republican, continue to do the bidding of the fossil fuel industry. I'll say the one chart you had with the crude oil production, if you add in the oil and the gas production as well, and those bars remain the same. The United States has actually been the largest producer of oil and gas in the world for the last 5 years, record amounts. I mean, so every year, historically, the United States produces more oil and gas than anyone else in the world. That is basically has to do with fracking, which of course was, if you look back at the Obama administration, one of his proudest accomplishments. Barack Obama infamously, after his time in office, would brag about how much oil he produced, how no one had ever pumped as much oil and gas as he had, alongside of also bragging about how the banks owed him because he was so good to him, right? And then Trump comes in, picks up from where Obama left off, and the same with the Biden White House. I mean, when you look at the priorities, and this is where you really have to see how the empire works and how this climate collapse, this climate crisis is the result of empire. If you look at the priorities within the United States, it was brought up before about how much the United States spends on its military. The base Pentagon budget this year will be about $900 billion. When you add in care for veterans, the nuclear weapons that are within the Department of Energy, the State Department's foreign military sales programs, as well as the interest on past military and war spending, that number really is about $1.3, $1.4 trillion a year that the United States spends on war and its military. The United States, through the Inflation Reduction Act, which was cited as being historic, as being a real commitment to taking on climate change, we spend approximately about $38 to $40 billion a year on climate change actions through our federal government, through the Inflation Reduction Act. So 1.3, 1.4 trillion versus $40 billion. Just to put that in even further context, this year, the United States Congress appropriated $38 billion worth of weapons that the Pentagon didn't even ask for, right? So the Congress is spending as much money on ships, planes, tanks, what have you, that the Pentagon didn't even ask for, as they are on combating climate change. I mean, we know, as brought up earlier as well, the United States military is the world's largest polluter. That's across all aspects of what we're talking about, or all aspects of environmental harm, whether it's actual just straight pollution, poisoning the ground, poisoning the air, poisoning the water, through climate change. The United States military is the world's largest institutional emitter of carbon. Frankly, they are ExxonMobil's biggest customer. And so that you can understand those linkages in between, when you look at the American empire and you understand the elites that populate the empire, the various power centers that populate the empire, and you have these various industries, if you want to call them that, certainly where you have that linkage then between the banks, the fossil fuel companies, and the weapons companies that then help determine American foreign policy. You can see that quite clearly, how they're all in this together. What's good for you is good for me. Best example I can give you of how this works in practice is with regards to, say, the Ukraine war. You have this case where in the 2012 debates, Barack Obama had a viral moment because he criticized Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney was asked in the debates, who is the greatest adversary for the United States? And Mitt Romney said Russia. And Barack Obama said something along the lines of like, hey, Mitt, the Cold War's calling. They want their foreign policy back. But then within 6 months to a year, the United States had taken an incredibly adversarial turn in its relationship with Russia. And there's a number of reasons for that. But one of the prime reasons is because you've had this fracking boom and you're now producing all this gas. And where are you going to sell it? And at that point, the biggest market for that gas was Europe. And who's the biggest supplier of gas to Europe? It's Russia, right? I mean, so you can understand the genesis of the Ukraine conflict. Again, other reasons for it as well. But one acute reason is this desire to capture the energy market in Europe for American producers. And so when people say there are no winners in this Ukraine-Russia war, it's actually, no, there is. The American energy companies are the winners, because what happened was you had the invasion of Ukraine, you have the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline, which in itself was an ecological catastrophe, right? Caused incredible environmental harm, incredible release of methane and other things as well. So it's the destruction of the sea life in that area, historic amount, biblical amount almost. But what you have, though, is you have the winner, one of the winners of this war has been the American energy companies, because they have won, if you want to call it that, the European gas market for the US. I mean, so you see how these things tie themselves together, and you can see these relationships and how the decisions are made, because it benefits various actors within the American empire that populate the elites of the American empire. What this means as we go forward in the future, and I think people understand the idea of climate collapse is going to lead to issues with resources. You're going to have issues with food security, droughts, population migration, those sorts of things. Those are all things that will make the world less secure. They're all things that will make the world less stable. And of course, people can very clearly see how, nations could go to war over those resources. It's possible, likely, maybe, but the main driver of conflict that will come from the climate collapse, that the climate collapse itself, of course, being pushed by the militarism of the American empire, and then those outside the empire that are responding to the empire's militarism, right? That collapse is going to push pressures on societies that are going to result in leaders that come to power on top of societies that are suffering. And when you have suffering societies that are suffering, you often have more extreme governments, right? And then with those more extreme governments, you tend to have degrees of nationalist desires, or just even the need to distract by going to war. I think Anna brought that up earlier, right? That's as old as recorded history. Certainly pull out your volume of Gibbons and types of where the Roman Empire was doing that, right? So what the climate collapse does is makes it more likely that wars will occur, one, because of resource issues, but also two, because of the harm, the pressure, the stress that societies will be under. You're more likely to have governments come to power that are looking for war as an answer to the problems of society, problems, again, that come from the climate collapse. So it's very much, the relationship is very much there. It's a self-reinforcing relationship. So as the militarism gets worse, the climate collapse gets worse. As the climate collapse gets worse, the militarism gets worse, right? It becomes the point now where it's almost a chicken and egg type of problem if you try and pull it apart and determine which is the actual prime driver of this. I'll also say one last thing. When this, we have in a couple of weeks, the next COP, the next annual climate conference meetings occurring in Azerbaijan, if I remember correctly. And, what you will see there, like you have seen in all these various treaties, all these various conferences, all these various commitments, is that the militaries are always excluded. So if you look at the Paris Accords, you look at, anything that comes out of the COPs, anything that has to do in most governments, particularly the NATO governments, the militaries are excluded from anything having to do with climate controls. With any attempt to mitigate what is occurring, the militaries are exempt from that. And so that's an issue as well, because the militarism that exists throughout the world makes these militaries off limits to even the thing that is the gravest and most existential threat we are facing, of course, aside from nuclear war.